The United States Supreme Court has delivered a historic blow to President Trump's global tariffs, sending shockwaves through the political and economic landscape. This landmark decision is not just about trade policy, it's about the very limits of presidential power and the checks and balances at the heart of American democracy. In a sharply worded opinion, the court ruled the tariffs an unconstitutional overreach of executive authority, emphasizing that no president is above the law, even in times of economic uncertainty or global tension. The case was brought forward by a coalition of small business owners and state governments who argued that the president cannot unilaterally impose sweeping taxes on imported goods without the explicit approval of Congress. Their challenge questioned the very foundation of how trade policy is made in the United States. The Trump administration, however, maintained that the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, granted the president broad authority to act in a national emergency, arguing that the growing trade deficit constituted such a crisis. They insisted these powers were necessary to protect American interests on the world stage. But challengers countered that this interpretation stretched the law far beyond its original intent, effectively allowing the president to bypass Congress and seize control over the nation's power to tax and regulate commerce, powers the Constitution reserves for the legislative branch. The tariffs had already generated a staggering $174 billion for the U.S. Treasury, but at a cost, raising prices for American consumers and businesses, disrupting supply chains, and fueling uncertainty in markets across the country. Now, with the Supreme Court's decision, the policy is halted in its tracks. The fate of that massive revenue is suddenly uncertain, and the ruling marks a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle over who truly controls America's economic destiny, the president or Congress. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation, and with this far-reaching judgment, the Supreme Court has reshaped the balance of power in Washington, sending a clear message about the enduring strength of constitutional checks and balances. President Trump's tariffs were rooted in his belief that unfair trade deals left the U.S. at a disadvantage, creating massive trade deficits. For years, he argued, American workers and industries suffered as foreign competitors flooded the market with cheaper goods, while U.S. exports struggled to compete abroad. This imbalance, he claimed, was not just an economic issue, but a threat to the nation's long-term prosperity and security. Trump pointed to shuttered factories, lost jobs, and declining industrial towns as evidence that the U.S. was being taken advantage of. He argued these deficits threatened national prosperity, and tariffs were needed to force other nations to change. The administration's message was clear. Without decisive action, the American dream would continue to slip away for millions of families. To justify sweeping tariffs, the administration invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, declaring trade deficits a national emergency. They linked these deficits to broader national security threats, including the influx of illicit fentanyl and other drugs, arguing that economic weakness made the country vulnerable to foreign manipulation and criminal activity. Trump warned of economic disaster if tariffs were overturned, framing them as essential to protect American jobs and sovereignty. He insisted that only by standing firm could the U.S. regain its economic independence and restore pride in its workforce. The Liberation Day tariffs imposed duties of 10% to 50% on imports from nearly every country, affecting a vast array of products from electronics to raw materials. These sweeping measures were designed to send a message: the era of unchecked imports and one-sided trade was over. Additional tariffs specifically targeted major trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and China, countries Trump accused of exploiting loopholes and undermining American industries. The administration hoped these targeted actions would force renegotiation of trade agreements and bring foreign governments to the bargaining table. The administration's strategy was a multi-front economic offensive, with the IEEPA tariffs as its most powerful weapon. Officials described it as a necessary, if aggressive, step to reset the rules of global commerce in America's favor. Critics, however, argued these tariffs were separate from other duties on steel and aluminum, which had different legal justifications. They warned that the broad use of emergency powers risked undermining established trade laws and could provoke retaliation from allies and rivals alike. The policy was dramatic, urgent, and controversial, reshaping global trade and sparking fierce debate among economists, business leaders, and politicians. Some saw it as a bold correction, while others feared it would trigger trade wars and economic instability. The administration insisted only tough action could fix decades of neglect, but the legal and economic risks were enormous. As the world watched, the US embarked on a high-stakes experiment, one that would test the limits of presidential power and the resilience of the global trading system. A coalition of small businesses and Democratic-led states led the legal fight against the tariffs, arguing they were an unpredictable tax threatening survival. Companies like Learning Resources said tariffs forced them to cut jobs or raise prices, hurting American consumers. Oregon's Attorney General and lawyer Neil Katyal argued the tariffs were an illegal tax, costing Americans trillions and violating Congress's authority. Nearly 50 top economists, including former Fed chairs, told the court trade deficits aren't emergencies and tariffs would harm every household. Major corporations reported financial harm, and studies showed consumers bore the brunt of costs. The challengers insisted the president's actions jeopardized jobs and made American companies less competitive. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court firmly rejected the administration's broad interpretation of presidential power under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The justices made it clear that the president's authority is not without boundaries, especially when it comes to matters that impact the nation's economy and the balance of power between government branches. The majority opinion ruled that trade deficits, while important, do not constitute national emergencies. This means the president cannot invoke emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on foreign goods simply because of economic concerns. The court emphasized that such actions would set a dangerous precedent, allowing future presidents to bypass established legal processes. Allowing the executive branch to act unilaterally in this way would effectively erase Congress's constitutional role in taxing and regulating commerce, undermining the careful system of checks and balances that defines American democracy. The court drew a clear line between true emergencies, such as war or sudden threats, and ongoing chronic economic issues. The justices warned that blurring this distinction could grant the presidency king-like powers, fundamentally altering the structure of government. By upholding the decisions of lower courts, the Supreme Court reasserted that the power of the purse, control over taxation and spending, belongs to Congress, not the president. This principle is a cornerstone of the Constitution. Importantly, the ruling was not about whether tariffs are good or bad policy. Instead, it focused on the fundamental question of who has the legal authority to make such impactful decisions for the country. Ultimately, the verdict stands as a powerful check on executive power and a landmark moment in the ongoing story of the separation of powers in the United States. The Supreme Court's decision will quickly affect the economy, businesses, and consumers. For shoppers, prices on imported goods should gradually fall as tariffs are removed, easing household budgets. Businesses relying on imports will see lower costs and improved competitiveness, while industries once shielded by tariffs, like steel, may face new challenges. The government must now refund billions collected in tariffs, straining the federal budget. Companies that restructured around tariffs must pivot again, creating instability and complicating long-term planning. The abrupt policy shift highlights the risks of sweeping executive actions. The ruling brings relief to many, but also uncertainty as the economy adjusts. The impact will ripple through supply chains, government finances, and everyday life. Supporters of Trump's tariffs saw them as bold tools to fight unfair trade, revive manufacturing, and protect national security. They argued tariffs forced countries like China to negotiate and encouraged buying American. Critics, including most economists, said tariffs were attacks on U.S. consumers and businesses, raising prices and hurting competitiveness. Retaliatory tariffs from other countries damaged American exports, especially for farmers and manufacturers. Opponents called the policy economically harmful and fundamentally illegal, consolidating too much power in the executive branch. The Supreme Court case became a flashpoint in the debate over protectionism, global trade, and the limits of presidential authority. With the court's ruling, the administration must dismantle the tariff regime and refund billions to importers. This creates logistical challenges and uncertainty as businesses file claims and await refunds. Trade policy now shifts back to Congress, where any future tariffs will require legislative approval and public debate. Lawmakers may seek new, limited powers for the president or return to traditional trade negotiations. The administration faces a choice: work with Congress or use narrower executive actions. Internationally, the ruling could ease trade tensions and open doors for renewed negotiations, but the core issues, like China's trade practices, remain unresolved. The U.S. must now find new, constitutionally sound strategies for global economic challenges. The Supreme Court's decision is a landmark for the separation of powers and the limits of presidential authority. It reaffirms that Congress, not the president, controls trade and taxation. Future presidents will need congressional approval for sweeping tariffs, making trade policy more democratic and transparent. The ruling shifts debate from the Oval Office to Congress, where public scrutiny and compromise are required. The legal defeat ends the era of unilateral trade wars. But the debate over protectionism and globalism continues. America's approach to the world economy will now be shaped by its elected representatives, not executive decree. The foundational principles of checks and balances and the rule of law remain paramount in U.S. trade policy.